Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Neil Cowland.
Thank you, everyone. Please take your seats. There's plenty of seats at the front. So hopefully you enjoyed your working lunch and the networking and the event today. So it's my pleasure to introduce our second guest speaker, Fiona Mactaggart. So Fiona will present on the impact of today's business of the Mordern Slavery Act. For CBRE, this is a very hot topic for our clients, our supply chain, and CBRE alike. So Fiona has served as a Labour MP for Slough since 1997 and stood down in this year's election in May. She was a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. Fiona was also the founder and secretary of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Prostitution and the Global Sex Trade, and is also the co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Human Trafficking and Modern-Day Slavery. So you need a big business card for those titles. So I'd like to welcome Fiona to the stage. Please put your hands together. Thank you very much.
Okay, you probably didn't expect to have a politician addressing you at this supply chain conference. Oops. And I hope that it works better than Theresa May's did yesterday. Let me just say, these letters are solid. So if one of them falls over, that's me done in for. But why am I talking to you about slavery? Wasn't that got rid of 200 years ago with William Wilberforce, who in 1807 moved the abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and that was followed some 20 years later by the Slavery Abolition Act. It's all over, isn't it? Well, no, unfortunately, it isn't. And this is a big issue for all of us as human beings, and it's a big issue for your business as well. Because modern slavery exists around the world. And what is it? This definition comes from the Modern Slavery Commissioner, Kevin Hyland. It's the definition that he uses to identify what modern slavery is. And it's not normally people being held in chains, although there are countries where people can be bought and sold. In Mauritania, in Sudan, these things still exist. People can be born, owned by someone else. Daesh, the terrorist group, actually published a list of the price of women that could be bought by its fighters. So that kind of slavery still exists, but modern slavery is a slightly different phenomenon. It's people being held in bondage by things other than chains and formal kinds of ownership, by debt, by threats and bullying. And it's worth noticing, what actually does it mean for me? There's obviously a spectrum. If people aren't being paid, is that always slavery? Well, if that is because there's a temporary glitch, you've got a big contract and they're paying late, and so employees, there's a cash flow problem. If it's remedied, that's not slavery, that's part of a spectrum of employment practices. But actually, there are people who find that they don't get paid for the whole of a contract, and then when they get the pay at the end of it, enormous and illegal deductions have been made for accommodation, transport, and so on. So I think it's important to make sure that there's an understanding about the sort of spectrum of exploitation which can create slavery. How? But this doesn't really matter to me. It's not very widespread. It only happens in bad companies. How widespread is it? Well, the International Labour Organization estimates that there are over 40 million people in forced labour around the world. They say that it's most prevalent in Asia and the Pacific, but Europe and Central Asia is actually the second area where this exists. And according to the estimates, there are more than 1.5 million people in modern slavery in developed economies. So this isn't just something which happens miles and miles away, it's something which happens on our doorstep. The difference between slavery now and in Wilberforce's day is that then it was public. You could see slaves marching behind their owners. You could see them publicly. Now it is hidden. And actually that means that these estimates could well be wrong. It's estimated that there are something like 13,000 people enslaved in Britain today, but the police and the Modern Slavery Commissioner both say that they believe that's an underestimate. And yet, although it's an underestimate, only 3,000 individual people in slavery were identified last year, and only something like 50 successful prosecutions of their slave masters were conducted. So it's a big hidden problem. What's it got to do with you? Here you are, good, well-run businesses, you're pleased to be here to network with other businesses, to talk about your products, your brands, what you're proud of. It really doesn't have anything to do with you, but actually it does. Because global supply chains, which do create employment, they create opportunities for economic and social development, and yet they also, when they're poorly managed, the demand for cheap labour, the lack of visibility of a distant supply chain, the dynamics of production in informal settings and markets can have negative implications and can create a risk for subjecting individuals to modern slavery. What factors are in that risk? The first is weak institutions and poor enforcement in many host countries. But actually it's not just in countries which have poor labour laws. It actually exists around the world. Now, there is a real temptation to ignore this, to say we won't do anything about it. I left Parliament this year, but in almost the whole of the last Parliament, I was banging on about this. I was saying that actually we need to engage companies in dealing with this issue. In 2012, I moved a private member's bill which was on transparency in supply chains, particularly trying to help companies identify this issue and to ensure that they use their muscle to help tackle this human rights scourge. Didn't get through. It's one of the things about an opposition politician, you get used to losing. But actually, I persuaded a colleague who had a ballot bill, which has a better chance of getting through the following year, to have a similar bill. That didn't get through either, beginning to feel a bit set back, but carried on banging on about it. We tend to get called nags, those of us. I mean, it's a very female applied word, isn't it? But actually, in my experience, nagging works eventually. You just have to be patient and you have to carry on doing it. So we did. And in 2013, the Centre for Social Justice produced a report on the extent of slavery in UK businesses and included in that a recommendation to tackle this issue through some supply chain legislation. And in the following year, the government produced a white paper and a draft modern slavery bill, which ignored the issue. I was on the pre-legislative scrutiny for that white paper and on the bill committee when the full bill came forward, still ignoring the issue, but carried on nagging. And actually, it was eventually included in what became the Mordern Slavery Act 2015. And that puts a requirement on companies to provide full transparency in their supply chains. And what it says is that you just have to report, that you need to report on any steps that you have taken during the financial year to ensure it's not taking place in any of your supply chains or in any part of your own business. And your own business includes any wholly owned subsidiary, even if it operates completely outside the UK. And you are still complying with the law if you say, my company hasn't done this. You just have to produce the statement. So this is really light touch. It's not dealt with by a big regulatory mechanism. It's just up for you to say this is what we do or don't do. And I think it's needed. One of the pieces of research which was done following this act found that 77% of companies think that there is a likelihood of modern slavery in their supply chain. Now, who does it apply to? The government provides guidance about what kind of company is subject to this regulation. And the first is the size of your annual turnover. And its turnover should be 36 million or more. And if that is you, then you are required to produce each financial year a statement. And one of the important things about this legislation is the way that it engages the top of the company. It's not just a bit of business for your HR person. It actually needs to be approved and signed by a director or partner. And I think that's a really important feature of the legislation. It has to be published on the company website if you have one. And it's interesting, the research shows that the thing that's made the most difference in the last year as companies start complying with this is the board level engagement with the issue. Because these statements have to be improved by the board and published on your website if you have one. Now, I thought, as I'm hosted by CBRE, let's have a look at their statement. And I think the interesting thing about this, it goes on beyond these paragraphs to provide specific information about, for example, training, due diligence, how it contracts with suppliers and so on. But the interesting thing about this statement, which in my view is a good one, is that it connects the business of tackling modern slavery with the existing values of the company. If you look at the second paragraph, our RISE values, respect, integrity, service, excellent, continue to be instrumental to our success. I would urge every company not to see this as a bolt-on. Oh gosh, we've got a new law, we've got to do this oppressive thing. Oh, let's get someone in HR or in supply chain procurement, whatever, to write something quickly and then we'll stick it on the supply chain, on the website. Actually, that doesn't work. But if you connect it with your company and the way your company does business, if you connect it to your company values, then it will work. And so, CBRE invited me here. It's my job probably to be nice to them, but actually it's easy because the way they have approached their statement absolutely does that. And that's not a requirement in the government guidance. It is actually just good business. And I would strongly urge every other company to do business in that way. Now, I think if you actually want to tackle slavery in the supply chains, one of the things you need to do is to work out how the exploiters are getting away with it. And I think that government has to take some responsibility here. Because who ends up in modern slavery? Overwhelmingly, it's people who are vulnerable. They're vulnerable because of poverty, because of debt, because of disability or low intellectual achievement. They're vulnerable because of immigration pressures, particularly in the UK. So one of the circumstances which has, in my judgment, made modern slavery more likely, more possible, is the fear of immigration authorities, which is exploited by the slave masters enormously. One of the most extreme examples of this was while I was a Home Office minister many years ago, when there were 23 cockle pickers who drowned off the sands in the northeast of England because their slave master didn't have any health and safety arrangements for when the tides came in, and they were killed. These were people who all lived in a terraced house, crammed together, and who were completely dependent on the company which was providing the seafood into actually supply chains of good companies to have enough food, to have any money, to be able to send money back to their families in China, and so on. So the first thing is that the people who are most likely to be subjected to modern slavery are people who are themselves vulnerable. And there is, as you know, an offence, you will know, an offence to employ someone who you should not be employing, who it's illegal. And that, of course, has increased the vulnerability because good companies will not employ people who haven't got the right to work. And so they get pushed further and further down the supply chain. And they get, they become more vulnerable to exploitative employers. I think the issue of precarious and uncertain work also adds to vulnerability. But one of the things that I would ask you all to focus on is the issue of employment agencies and labour contractors, because that is very often where this abuse is found. The person who can always find someone to do the job might well be the person who is exploiting someone, because they can force people to do jobs that they don't want to. And because it's an additional layer of separation between employers and workers, that actually means that the workers are more exposed to deceptive recruitment practices, which will say to someone in Poland or whatever, you're coming to work in a bar. And then the lass who thinks she's coming to work as a barmaid ends up in a brothel. And, you know, I've met many young women to whom that has occurred. But actually, the same thing can occur in supply chains providing workers for perfectly legitimate companies. So what are you going to do? That's the big issue. Fiona's told me there's a big problem. What am I supposed to do about it? I'm not an expert in these things. So one of the things that you need to do is turn to people who are experts. The Ethical Trading Initiative base code is worth getting hold of because it's a kind of guidebook, it's a kind of handbook for people like you to look at, to audit your own systems and supply chains to make sure that you have tackled this issue as well as possible to eradicate slavery and forced labour. But actually, it's not enough just doing it from a guidebook. I said earlier that the good thing about the CBRE statement is that it starts from the values that it has as a company. One of the things that I would absolutely urge everyone to do is to start from your values. You do not want to be slave masters. You do not want that to be an aspect of the way that you make profits for your shareholders. Actually, what you want is to be a company which generates respect from the people who work for it and from the people who own it. And so I am a bit of a skeptic about the very many, and they're lovely, small voluntary organisations who will come to you and say, we'll fix it for you, we know how to do these kind of things. And I think an awful lot of the companies in this hall wouldn't dream of doing that for their audits. So why would they dream of doing that for this kind of thing? It seems to me that actually we should be using the kind of high-end, highly skilled organisations to support companies to do this. Now, I'm sure that people in this hall are worried, oh God, if I get completely transparent and there is a problem, am I going to get pilloried? Well, let me just reassure you that one of the things, as well as trying to encourage companies like you to do this, one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing is talking to campaigners to say, do not start by pointing the finger if someone is being transparent. Start by congratulating them for the transparency and working with them to end the exploitation. Because actually, that's how this legislation is supposed to work. It's not supposed to give you a chance to poke in the eye the companies who actually collaborate, who do serious work on it, who don't just write a quick fix type statement, but who actually uncover the areas of risk. Because that's what you need to do. Identify where the biggest risk is and concentrate on it. And I think focusing the effort at the beginning is really, really important. And if your supply chain is very diverse and very complex, you're not going to be able to focus on every bit of it at once. So think about where this is most likely to occur, and think about, you might have perfect policies and procedures. There are companies which have brilliant policies and procedures. I used to go around talking about the John Lewis Partnerships policies and procedures, which were very robust before the legislation. And yet, when Easy Beds was using slave labour to make beds, they supplied them to John Lewis. So actually, it requires quite a deep dig into the areas that are highest risk. And so I think that's the place to start. Really focus your effort on the highest risk area and make sure you know what it is. So you need to identify the risks. Where does this kind of thing happen? Well, this is a short list of the kinds of areas where it might be most at risk, where you have a high turnover workforce, where there's low skill and low expectations of the workers. So that's particularly obvious in things like food packing and processing, where we expect very low wages. And actually, chicken catching is very skilled, but it's not a skill that's particularly recognised. So in those areas, that's where the risk is bigger. Some of the risks are actually imposed by the demands that you make on your supply chain. So the need for flexibility, short lead-in times, if you have late payments or cross pressures, they absolutely add to the risks. But there are systems that you can put in place which will help. The first is obviously good record keeping, but records aren't enough. You actually need to go and talk to people. Now, you know that's a basic of business, actually knowing who your people are, conversing with them at all levels of the company, not just with the senior management levels, but actually getting down to the people who are doing the business. And you need to make sure that those things are properly recorded. Now, it's not just within your company that the risks exist. It also can exist in the environment in which you operate, so that the countries where the risks are highest are the countries where there is a lack of access to labour rights. If there's active trade union representation, it is likely that this is not going to happen. It's not certain because, of course, trade union leaders don't always listen to everybody. You know, you can quite often find that they're good at talking to the guys on the shop floor and slightly less good at talking to the girls on the shop floor. And if those guys are drowning out the voices of their female colleagues, this sort of thing might continue to happen. So, you know, there is a job for government here to make sure that there is a proper framework of labour rights, but actually there's a big job for business within that framework. So we audit this kind of thing. We should be okay, shouldn't we? Well, actually, audits don't catch criminals. They're not enough. One of the things that an audit does is it's frozen in time. It's much better at money than people. If you look at the reports that have happened this week about the company, and this isn't a slavery issue, the company which was alleged to have changed supply dates, killing dates for the chickens in its supply chain. That's been very damaging for that company's reputation. But the company which was providing the chickens passed audits by the health and safety executive on 3 occasions. So they weren't found to be in breach. And yet they have lost their biggest customers in the food supply sector because of this. So just thinking about auditing systems isn't enough. Making sure that you've actually dug behind them. Is the information that you're getting out of an auditing system absolutely true and transparent? For example, if the person who you're talking to is not English as a first language speaker, who's providing the interpretation? Could the person who's providing the interpretation be the person who's involved in exploiting them? That is not uncommon, and it's one of the ways that the exploiters conceal this issue. So there are companies which have used clever bits of new technology so that frontline workers can report concerns anonymously within their factories, and that has hugely changed some of the processes and practices within those sites within the company, because the frontline workers have a way of feeding back the concerns about bullying and about exploitation that they might be facing. So we've got ethical and financial issues to face here. And, you know, we all know that cost pressures are the biggest pressure in business. You know, you need to make sure that you are meeting your budgets, that you're generating your profit targets, and so on. But actually, you need to think of that as a whole, because your cost pressures are shifted if you just think about cost and don't think about the expense that could be caused by you losing a big contract because of the reputational consequences of having slavery in your supply chains. There are other pressures. One of the things that has made this problem worse, in my judgment, is the impact that Brexit has had on labour shortages, particularly in some of those low-skill areas like food processing, where apples are picked by migrant workers, and because of being part of the European Union, we hadn't got to refresh the immigration policies which used to provide temporary migrant labour to do apple picking and so on. But actually, now we will be going to have to do it, particularly as people feel that they won't be welcome here in Europe. The transparency in the supply chain legislation that I've been banging on about is actually one of the pressures. But it is also a massive opportunity. You have investor pressure, customer expectations, and you need to think, is your auditing system properly identifying risks, issues, so that you can avoid the reputational risk which would be enormous if you find slavery in your supply chain. And that's where we go to next. You start by being mindful of that reputational risk. There are legal sanctions. Actually, there isn't an inspectorate for most companies on this, although the Gangmasters Licensing Authority, which used to work just in food and shellfish and food processing, is now transformed into the Gangmasters Licensing and Labour Abuse Authority and has a much wider remit. It doesn't have any more money, so it isn't actually going to be a particularly heavy-booted regulator. Its practice is to tend to try to work side by side with business. What other sanctions are there? The sanctions in the legislation aren't fundamentally in the supply chain bits of the Mordern Slavery Act. They are in some of the other bits of the Act where a victim can apply for compensation. The clauses in the Mordern Slavery Act which require transparency in the supply chains, the only remedy is that the government can injunct you to produce a statement. Well, that's not very burdensome, is it? But actually, I think this is much better law than most laws. What we're saying is you don't need a police force to police what you do inside your company. We want you to take the lead, to actually, you understand your companies, politicians like me don't. And so it is worth you doing this because it can increase consumer confidence, because it can improve your employee morale, because it can mean that your company is seen as a brand leader because of its ethical stance on these issues, because it is bold, because it is open. These are all good things. And so I think that it's much better for you to lead than for courts to catch you out. And that's really how this law is structured. It's giving you a chance to lead on this issue. And what is that leadership in practice? And I think this is this is produced by Halt Business School and Ashridge Education. And it's based on research with a range of companies, mostly quite large companies, companies which are seen as brand leaders, on actually what they see as good practice. And I think the most important message for this is the top line. The engagement of senior leaders is the strongest enabler of corporate action on modern slavery. The thing that the law has changed is, instead of this being an issue which is dealt with somewhere in the middle of the company, it is an issue which is attended to at the top of the company, amongst the people who have to sign off this statement. And the engagement of senior leaders in companies has doubled since the passage of the Act, and it's only been in force for a year. So that is the thing which makes the biggest difference. All the other people around the outside are the other groups of people who are involved in this, and you would expect that the people who are responsible for corporate social responsibility or human resources are involved. But actually, I think the important message is leadership from the top, engaging people at every level of your company in this issue. Make it part of your values. And does it make a difference? Well, it does change how things happen. It's tended to produce better long-term partnerships with suppliers and companies who are depending upon them. It's meant that businesses come together, collaborate. It's really interesting talking to retailers who I've had a lot of conversations with about this. that they're actually working together much more closely on how they address these risks and issues together, because they know about where the risks are in retail. And you find competitor companies collaborating in a really useful way to try and deal with some of these things. It's got better engagements between the companies, with government, with non-governmental organisations, trade unions. The best systems involve workers in finding solutions. As I said, the top is really important in the company, but it's no good if the top say it's important and the people on the front line feel that it's got nothing to do with them, because they won't help the people in leadership to deal with it. I think one of the important changes which this legislation doesn't require you to do, but has actually provoked some companies to do, and I'm just going to cite one example, which is the co-op, which decided that it wasn't just going to try and get rid of slavery in its operations and in its supply chain. It decided that it would try and do something about the victims. And I want to end by asking you all to follow that lead, because I think it's a really intelligent way of dealing with this issue. What the co-op do is they're working with a voluntary organisation which has identified people who have been exploited in this way, some of the 13,000 people in Britain who are exploited every year. And obviously, as long as those people have the right to work, and that's one of the things that the voluntary organisation identifies, the co-op offers them a period of paid work experience and then a non-competitive interview and an appointment if there is a role available. Now, not every company has opportunities to do that, but actually I suspect that every company could think of a way that fits your company to actually give a remedy to people who have been exploited in this way. And so, as well as understanding how the law works, what it means for you, I suppose my message to you is do something more than what the law requires of you. See if you can be part of the solution. See if you can actually help those people who've been exploited in this way to build a future life. I talked not long ago to the mother of a man who for 15 years had been kept living in basically a dog kennel, working on small labour jobs, providing people with drop curbs and front walls and things like that. And he was eventually found, not by the police, but really by her. And when he was found after 15 years in these situations, he had rickets. He was profoundly ill. His exploiters have been prosecuted and jailed. He, of course, hasn't, in the 15 years he's been working like a dog, hasn't made any pension contributions, hasn't existed on the radar of any kind of public authority. And actually finding ways to recompense people who've been exploited in that way is a challenge for all of us. And it's a challenge that business can actually play a lead in and be proud of playing a lead in. I'm glad to advertise that the co-op has done that, not because I have any particular commitment to the co-op, but just because I think it's an example that I want to show you that if your company does something like that, you can get big ups from Labour MPs, you can get praise from unexpected quarters, and I think that's something that you might benefit from. So with that, thank you. I'm very happy to take any questions if anyone has any. If you want to ask questions, I think there are microphones. I can't see them. That's because the light's on me and not on you. So if anyone wants to ask me any questions, I hope I haven't bored you into silence. That was not my intention, I promise. No? One of the things about this issue is that people are a bit worried that if they talk, and if they're honest, they're going to be singled out as being exploiters. And as I say, I've spent a lot of time saying to the kind of people who are very tempted to be finger pointers, that actually the point about this legislation is not to behave like that, is it's an opportunity to work with people to make things better. Any questions? Yeah, there's one here.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say this is absolutely brilliant to hear, and coming from a company that also has a modern slavery policy is something that we truly believe in. But what I've found is that you have a lot of people which actually understand what we're trying to do, but then you have a workforce that doesn't. And I was wondering if there's any resources that you would know that can help those staff to actually realise what companies are trying to do to make a better place, not only for those in need, but for the future of their business as well.
Well, if you think your staff doesn't, then one of the things you have to do is talk to them more, isn't it? I mean, I think if you talk about slavery to people, the first response is, well, it doesn't happen here. And then when people learn about how people are exploited, the second response actually is, it shouldn't happen here, and what can I do to make a difference? And that really is a response which extends to the most apathetic, and I know that because I talk about it a lot. So I think one of the things to do is, as I say, it is really worth building it into the values of your company. That's why I praised the way in which CBRE had constructed their statement. That actually it's worth saying that these values include making sure that people aren't exploited through modern slavery. Now, that might require you doing a bit of education of the kind of Jack the lad on the shop floor who says this is slave conditions, when actually he's just trying it on a bit. And so it's worth saying that there's a spectrum of exploitation where people who have agency and control and can leave are in a completely different position to people who can't leave because of the way that they're exploited. And I think it's just worth having those conversations and saying to the people at the front line, and in my view, this is where businesses go wrong. They haven't had the conversations with the people who actually do the front line of the business. Actually engage them in making a difference here, saying it's down to you. If one of your colleagues, or if colleagues in a particular part of the company seem to be, who come in, say, to do a temporary piece of work, seem to be lacking in agency, seem to be fearful, seem to be unable to really step up, how can we help? How can we make a difference? How can you make a difference? Now, one of the ways that the bosses can make a difference is by increasing training and actually giving people certified skills so that they get the value, so that they own some of the value of what they learn through working for you. But actually, I think the other really important thing is ensuring that people on the work floor understand that they're part of this, that they can make a difference, and that if they report an issue of concern, things happen. It's no good having a system which people can report issues of concern and then there's a very long silence, is there? Because when that happens, they're never going to report again. And so you need to have systems which are responsive to concerns. So stirring up concerns without responsive systems is dangerous, because actually it will silence concerns in the future. But if you can establish properly responsive systems, then you should stir up the concerns and enable people to say, our company wants to be a slave-free company. Our company wants everyone who works for it to be properly and fairly rewarded, to have their talent recognized, to have agency in their work. And if they don't, we won't tolerate it. Help us to make sure that that happens. And I'm confident that if you do that, it will work. No others? Oh dear. Oh, here's one.
Hello?
Just here.
Hello?
Oh, and over there.
I'll stand up so you can see me. You mentioned earlier that slavery is a global issue. I was wondering if there was any kind of collaboration between the different governments or any organisations that provides information on where there's any high-risk areas or how we might deal with those issues.
Sorry, I'm a bit deaf and the microphone distorted your voice a little.
Okay, so the question was, where can we get information on global areas of risk related to slavery?
I suggest, I think after this you might get copies of the slides and the ethical base code, the base code guidance on modern slavery, which is produced by the Ethical Trading Initiative, is a good place to start. So get hold of this, and the slides will have a link to how to get hold of it. That's the first thing. But actually, if you Google modern slavery, the world's full of people who think they can help solve your problem. My view is that you are the person who's going to help solve your problem. Now, if you need to find out more, do the Google, read the bump. But then think about the culture of your company. What will work in our kind of company? We're not doing food processing, so we haven't got a risk of Chinese cockle pickers, but actually in construction, say, we know that there are risks. That's one of the areas that Kevin Highland has identified as there being risks of the relatively low-skilled jobs on a building site being exploited through a labour supplier. Who are our labour suppliers? What are we doing with them? So, I think starting with a Google and the ETI base code guidance is a good place to start. But then you actually just need to use what you know better than anyone else. Your business. Someone else. Yeah.
So a lot of UK businesses have got very complex supply chains, and there may well be people dotted right across EMEA and Asia providing goods, providing towards goods and services ultimately for the company based in the UK. So what are your thoughts about how companies can ensure that all organisations within their entire supply chain are compliant?
Well, these statements that you have to produce are annual. The idea is building on them year by year. And that's why I said start by focusing on an area where you think the highest risk is. Because I don't think that every company is going to be able to sort it all straight away. And I think that expecting that is romantic. And as well as talking to people like you, I talk to the romantics and say, really, this is not going to happen overnight, but if you look at the clothing industry, what happened in Rana Plaza actually meant that there was a real focus on clothing supply from Bangladesh. And that was the right thing to start at, because they had recognized that here is an area of very high risk. And so I think what you need to do is be really clear that you're not going to manage to solve every issue in the supply chain. You can put in place processes and rules and regulations, but you're not going to know if they're really working, because, people can tick boxes very easily. They'll lie. These, the guys who are slave masters are expert liars. They want to confuse you. So actually drilling deep on the area where you think the risk is highest first, and then every year, as this rolls out, what we're going to see is companies building on what they've achieved in a previous year, year by year. And I think probably being clear from the start that you have focused on a particular area to start with, and that you recognize that there are risks elsewhere, but you're starting with the area of highest risk and working with them and doing deep dive with them and building your relationships with them. That's the first place. The other thing is to actually make those relationships real, I think. Instead of your supply chain being full of people who are so far away from you that the kind of values of your company haven't got through that far, you actually need to work with the people who are closer to you, who are subcontracting, to make sure that they recognize that they have a role in communicating those values and those processes as well as you. And you're really engaging with them to find out if they're doing it or if they're just telling you they're doing it. Because I think it's twofold, as it were. A really clear focus on areas of highest risk and trying to ensure that there is a culture which moves through the supply chain, which doesn't just depend on the central company being the only push, but actually through your relationships with your people in the supply chain, it's kind of normalized, and that they feel that it's their job, not just your job. I think that's the way to do it. And it's not straightforward. No one's pretending it's straightforward. It's one of the reasons why I think it would be inevitable that an inspectorate to deal with it would fail, because it requires continuing relationships over time. And that's only going to be able to be delivered by you and by your partners. I think the other thing to do is to encourage a respect for workers' rights as part of the culture of your company. To say that we expect workers' concerns to be listened to and so on. I think actually saying that that is part of the way we do business, that we want the people who work within our supply chain to feel proud of where they work and to feel good about where they work and feel listened to. I think that's also quite important, because if they do, it will be impossible for the slave masters to run.
Put your hands together, please. Thank you. Thank you.